Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from today. And welcome to today's webinar titled The FDA Breakthrough Device Program, Regulatory and Reimbursement Insights. It's great to see so many people on the webinar today. I hope that wherever you are joining us from, you're continuing to stay safe and healthy and well. My name is Josh Dowd. I'm Senior Vice President with LSX Leaders in London, and delighted to be hosting today's webinar, the next in our Medical Device Innovation Series in partnership with MCRA. It's safe to say that the topic of today's webinar has generated significant interest, and we're really looking forward to a great session today. I will shortly be handing over to our expert speakers from MCRA, but very briefly, while we wait for anyone joining a little bit late, and for any newcomers to us in this series, we at LSX are a community and network of executives in the life science and healthcare space. We work with CEOs from medtech, health tech, and biotech businesses, big pharma and other commercial leaders, and the full range of the investor base in life sciences, as well as other key stakeholders. Many may know us from some of the industry-leading events, conferences, and partnering events that we run in Europe and the US. We hope to be able to continue those physical events as soon as possible, but delighted to still be connecting, informing, educating, and sharing expertise amongst our community in the interim. So we're delighted to be working with MCRA for the latest in this series of medical technology innovation webinars. You'll know MCRA as a leading advisory and research partner for medical device sector, and the firm has a wide and deep array of expertise, but today we are focusing in on two core areas of that expertise, regulatory and reimbursement, and specifically around the FDA Breakthrough Device Program. So before I hand over to our speakers for today, firstly, John Doucet, who is a recent former FDA Policy Lead who managed the Breakthrough Device Program, Tonya Dowd and John McDermott. A couple of quick points to mention from me before we kick off. We will have the opportunity at the end of the presentation to put any questions that you might have to our speakers. So I would encourage you all to please make use of this time and to ask any questions that you may have using the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen and the Zoom application. And at the end of the presentation, we'll look to get to and answer as many as we can. If you do see a question that you wanted to ask yourself that's already in the Q&A, you can also upvote for that question to show that you're also interested in the answer, and we can look to address those questions first. So please do use this function and ask any questions that you might have at any point throughout the session. But that's it from me, and it's my pleasure to hand you over to John Doucet from MCRA. John.
So welcome, everyone. So glad you could join us today. My name is John Doucet. I'm the Senior Director of Neurology Regulatory Affairs at MCRA. Before joining MCRA, as Josh said, I was the policy lead for the FDA's Breakthrough Device Program. Tonya and John?
Hi, good morning and good afternoon, everyone. I'm Tonya Dowd, and I'm the Vice President of Reimbursement, Health Economics, and Market Access here at MCRA.
And I'm John McDermott. I'm Senior Director of Reimbursement Strategy here at MCRA.
Great. So John again. So I'm going to address the regulatory side of the Breakthrough Device Program. Tonya and John will then discuss the reimbursement side, and then together we'll answer your questions about both sides of the program. So first off, any runners out there, even if you're not a runner, I think we'd all agree doing this would not be a good idea. And it's also not a good idea to start developing your reimbursement and market access plan after receiving FDA marketing authorization for your device. Early and integrated planning that blends regulatory, clinical study, and reimbursement considerations sets you up for both short and long-term success. And I'm fortunate to have joined a company that's built for this purpose. So MCRA is unique. We're a full-service CRO, which considers the regulatory, reimbursement, clinical evidence, quality, and compliance requirements throughout a product's life cycle. We have world-class expertise in all these areas that work together, allowing our CRO to design and execute clinical studies that resonate with all relevant stakeholders, and most importantly, which bake in the commercialization plan and pathway into each step of the process. So many times when we first meet clients, they're usually thinking of a sequential strategy. Plan A for regulatory, plan B for reimbursement. It's totally understandable. Very different decision makers, FDA, Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, private payers, each have different requirements, ask for different kinds of evidence to meet statutory and payer criteria. However, this sequential strategy is high risk for the future viability of your company. For example, CMS has created special payment privileges for breakthrough devices, but you still need to apply. And none of these privileges exist today for private payers or for Medicaid patients. Best to think about questions like this one early in device development, even for breakthrough devices. Evidence generation, as we all know, is expensive. Optimal is least burdensome. An integrated plan that on the one hand recognizes the sequential nature of device development and at the same time bakes into each step considerations from the entire timeline is one that promotes generating the right information at the right time to the right stakeholders to meet their respective requirements. Okay, let me get off my soapbox and describe the FDA's Breakthrough Device Program. So back in 2015, FDA leadership recognized that some devices are game changers because of new technology or because they treat patients with life-threatening or irreversibly debilitating conditions. And the early access pathway was created to devote additional attention and FDA resources to these particular devices. So the Congress said, great idea, FDA. We love this pilot program. So they wrote a law formalizing the Breakthrough Device Program and specifying some of its features, such as the designation criteria. So FDA then issued guidance that described how to obtain the designation and how the program was going to be run. So here's one thing that you may not be obvious to those of you who haven't worked at the FDA. Guidance documents are written by FDA leaders, whereas the day-to-day execution of the program, the decisions about designation requests, the interactions about breakthrough devices, that's performed by staff. So my role as policy lead for the program, in a nutshell, was closing this gap between leadership and staff to ensure the program was being run in accordance with the rules and the purpose of the program. So the purpose of the Breakthrough Device Program is to expedite patient access to breakthrough medical devices. And this happens in two major ways. First, it focuses FDA's attention on breakthrough devices by raising those submissions to the top of staff's and senior managers' to-do list. And it promotes collaboration between FDA and industry. Now, even though many interaction mechanisms exist today for all devices that support interactions with industry, FDA created new ones specifically for breakthrough devices and to expedite their development. Now, the only way to unlock access to them is to submit a breakthrough designation request and demonstrate that you meet the breakthrough device criteria. So a designation request can be submitted anytime prior to a marketing application. And I'm going to describe the criteria for getting a designation in a moment. But for now, here's a list of the 4 new interaction mechanisms created solely for breakthrough devices to promote collaboration and expedite their development. They do that in several ways, and I'm not going to explain all of them today, but I just want to focus on one in the next slide, which highlights an important one linked to the sprint and DDP mechanisms. So consider the pre-submission timeline for a standard non-breakthrough device. So FDA will provide written feedback on content and questions no later than day 70 and hold a meeting 5 days later. So between day 0 when you submit your, when they receive your submission and day 70, typically it's silence. So think if you were collaborating with someone and you could only talk to them every 75 days. It might take a while to get anything done, right? Well, the standard pre-submission process is not really set up for collaboration with the FDA. It's more for confirmation. In other words, you've done your research and you have a good idea about the testing requirements, endpoints, et cetera, but you're just looking to de-risk the situation and get confirmation from FDA that, yes, you're right, you're going in the right direction. Now, consider the sprint or DDP timeline for a breakthrough device. You're talking to the FDA on day 7, and then it's back and forth over the next few weeks. So this is a timeline that promotes collaboration and identifying the right direction for a breakthrough device together. So it sounds like a great program with great benefits, right? So how do you get in? So here are the criteria that need to be met and that were written by Congress in order for a device to be designated breakthrough and access those special interaction mechanisms. You must meet criterion 1 and one of the subparts of criterion 2. So criterion 1 is the most important. If you meet that one, as a practical matter, you're going to meet criterion 2 as well. So one important point about these criteria and the program that is often overlooked: you do not need to have some amazing new technology to be designated a breakthrough device. There is only one subpart of criterion 2 that even mentions technology, and you don't have to meet it. The program is to promote devices that will have a breakthrough impact on public health, not solely those that have amazing new technology, unlike anything that's come before. So over the next few slides, I said criterion 1 is the most important. So we're going to focus on criterion 1. And I'll focus on keywords in the statutory criterion in the first one and what FDA has said about how to interpret them. So FDA explained there needs to be a reasonable expectation that a device could provide for more effective treatment or diagnosis relative to current standard of care in the United States. So that's really important because it sets the bar your device needs to clear. So many of you may think, I know what standard of care is, but standard of care has a very specific meaning in the context of the Breakthrough Device Program. For a medical product to be considered standard of care, it needs to have received a marketing authorization for the indication being considered. So no off-label use of medical products is considered in standard of care in the context of evaluating your breakthrough designation request. And second, the medical product has to be currently marketed in the United States and be a relevant option for patients with the identified disease or condition. So, but what does that mean? More effective than standard of care. So I'm not showing everything that FDA wrote about this in the guidance document, but actually the rest of the text, even if I showed it to you, it doesn't provide a specific definition. And that used to frustrate me when I would get questions from industry and staff, like, what does it mean? In my opinion, now, a year and a half later, that's by design. That's by design. FDA wants industry and staff to think broadly about what it means for a device to provide more effective treatment or diagnosis versus standard of care. If FDA wanted to define effectiveness specifically, they would have done so. For example, they could have cited the regulatory definition of effectiveness in the guidance document, but they didn't do that. So let me give you an example, a real simple one, of a device that FDA might want to receive the breakthrough designation. Consider if your device had similar or the same effectiveness as standard of care, but had features that allowed it to be accessed by a greater number of people. So think of a digital health product that could be worn or carried in your pocket. Even though the product might offer the same effectiveness as standard of care on some key clinical endpoints, the fact that more people can access the treatment or diagnostic would be a reasonable argument that it's more effective than standard of care in the context of the Breakthrough Device Program. The point here is to think about public health impact when thinking about Criterion 1. So the last part of Criterion 1 is frequently overlooked. You must specify a patient population that has a life-threatening or irreversibly debilitating condition. So FDA describes what those phrases mean in the guidance document, but the important point is that the patient population must be specified in your indications for use statement. If you're granted the designation, the letter you receive from the FDA specifies your device and the verbatim indications for use statement that you included in the designation request. And the FDA will expect you to develop evidence to characterize the risks and benefits of the device in that specific breakthrough population. So what might that evidence generation plan look like, specifically for planning what patients to include in your pivotal clinical study? So the green circle on the left represents the breakthrough patient population that you've been granted after FDA review of your designation request. So the larger circle to the right represents the pivotal study patient population. Notice they don't have to be the same. The pivotal study population can include patients that don't have life-threatening or irreversibly debilitating condition. But FDA will expect and press you to include the breakthrough population as shown in the figure. So consider the following important questions for the team designing this study. So to the regulatory experts, a question might be, what percentage of the pivotal study cohort needs to be from the breakthrough population in order for FDA to include them in our cleared or approved indications for use statement? In other words, for FDA to state, when you receive marketing authorization, we just cleared or approved a breakthrough device. To the clinical study experts on the team, how hard is it going to be to recruit breakthrough patients? How many sites do I need to enroll these patients at a reasonable rate? To the stats members of the clinical team, what percentage of the study cohort can be breakthrough without jeopardizing the potential for a successful study? And finally, to the reimbursement experts on the team, do coding, coverage, and payment pathways exist today for the breakthrough and non-breakthrough population? Are we generating the kinds of evidence that will unlock CMS special payment privileges for breakthrough devices? What will private payers think of the evidence we generate in this clinical study we're planning? Is it going to be acceptable? The point is, all these experts need to be at the table when designing your pivotal clinical study so that the results resonate with the key regulatory and reimbursement stakeholders. And that's MCRA's model when working with clients to design their clinical studies for breakthrough devices and all medical products. My final message is that optimal evidence generation is least burdensome. And that is achieved with early planning that blends regulatory and reimbursement considerations. My task for all of you when developing a breakthrough device is to ask yourself questions like these, even as early as when you're writing the indications for use statement for your breakthrough designation request. When you're writing that statement and you're making changes to address FDA concerns to receive the designation, you're making changes to your reimbursement strategy, whether you know it or not. So now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, John McDermott, to talk about reimbursement considerations for breakthrough devices. John?
Okay, thank you, John. Thanks for the good setup. Actually, can you go to the next slide? So wouldn't it be nice if this were an entirely linear process where innovator companies started working with the FDA, trying to get their regulatory approval set. And then after that was done, then they could move over to focusing on the reimbursement and get that set. And then, everything is all set once you come to market. And wouldn't it be even better if reimbursement were integrated into the breakthrough designation? But it doesn't work that way. And as John just said, it does help to start both of those considerations, both the regulatory and the reimbursement early, including considering the reimbursement as you're deciding to pursue breakthrough. Reimbursement can be a reason to do it, but it's not the only reason. Now, all that being said, there are some very real benefits from a reimbursement perspective when you do have breakthrough designation, and those come in the form of an expedited way of qualifying for new technology payments. And we'll go into great detail on those next. So next slide. Okay, so let me provide just a little bit of background on reimbursement. When we're talking about reimbursement, we're really talking about three concepts. The first is coverage, and that talks about whether a service or device is eligible for payment by an insurance company. And that's where your evidence package comes in on the coverage side. The second is coding, and coding describes how a device or procedure can be communicated to the insurance company for billing. And then the third is payment, and payment refers to the payment methodology as well as the actual payment amounts. And I'm going to cover coding and payment in my section, and then when I turn it over to Tonya, she's going to talk about coverage. Okay, next slide. Now, just a few additional background items here. In the US, when a procedure is done in a facility, that actually generates two bills. One bill is for the physician's professional fee, and the other bill is for the hospital or the ambulatory surgical center payment. And that's typically where the breakthrough device is being billed, on the hospital side or the ASC side, and that's what I'm going to focus on. So next slide. Now, under Medicare, the actual payment system is determined by the setting of care. So in the hospital inpatient setting, Medicare's payment system is called the Inpatient Prospective Payment System, or IPPS, and the payment method is called a Medicare Severity Diagnosis Related Group, or an MSDRG, and the codes that are used on the inpatient side are ICD-10-CM for diagnosis and ICD-10-PCS for procedure. Now, basically what a DRG is, it's a bundled payment that's meant to cover the entire cost of the hospitalization for each case. And the system is called prospective because the payments are set in advance, and there are about 1,500 different payment groups, and the groups are customized for the type of procedure. So there may be cardiology or cardiac stenting groups, hip replacement groups, things like that. But whatever care a patient gets comes out of that single bundled payment that covers the whole hospitalization. Then if we look over at the ASC or the hospital outpatient side, there's a related but different system called the outpatient prospective payment system. And that has as its methodology the ambulatory payment classification, or the APC. And the coding is also different. Outpatient and ASC claims use CPT and HCPCS codes, as well as diagnosis codes. Now, an APC is like a DRG in that it is a bundled payment. However, on the outpatient side, a procedure can result in more than one payment. So a procedure might be able to bill for and receive payment for 2 or 3 APCs, versus on the inpatient side, it's just that single DRG payment. Okay, next slide. Now, here's the problem with Medicare. The way that they set rates for the current year is based on data from 2 years ago. So we're just entering the 2021 season. The inpatient rates are already updated for 2021. The outpatient rates will update January 1st. But those updates are based on data that was collected back in 2019. So typically, let's say that you launched your product non-breakthrough in 2019, then Medicare would collect those claims for a year. Then they would take a whole year through their regulatory process to analyze and propose the new rates. And only then do the payments update to include the new technology. That's the problem, is this long lead time to getting the payments updated. So what Congress has established are some technology add-on payments to get payment established for new technology sooner. And on the inpatient side, it can accelerate that 2-year process by 21 months. So, potentially 3 months after FDA approval, you could have an extra payment on the inpatient side. And then on the outpatient side, it can accelerate it by just about the same, 20 months. So that's one of the pathways that's available for new technologies. Okay, next slide. Now, the 2 pathways I'm talking about, on the inpatient side, it's called New Technology Add-on Payment, or NTAP. And on the outpatient side, it's called Transitional Pass-Through Payment. And they each have distinct requirements, but some of them are similar. So for example, in both cases, the new technology has to demonstrate that it's new, meaning that it's not already included in the payment rates. The new technology also has to demonstrate substantial clinical improvement. So that's the body of the published literature and the clinical studies demonstrate an improvement over existing technologies. And then they both have to demonstrate a cost criteria. Now, one thing is very important, these are not included in the breakthrough designation pathway. If you want to pursue these, you have to apply for them on your own initiative directly to CMS. And for NTAP, those applications are due once a year. This year it was October 16th. It's always in October. And if approved, NTAP would go into effect the following October. On the outpatient side, for pass-through, you can apply for that quarterly. You have to have your FDA clearance or approval, and then the applications are due 1 month before the start of a quarter for the following quarter. So a March application would result in pass-through payment approved in July. So that's the cycle. And these are open to any new technologies with the full applications here. Okay, next slide. Now, this is one of the most important slides in my section here. This is the benefit of having breakthrough. And the benefit is on the NTAP side, if you have breakthrough, CMS takes FDA's word that the technology is new and that the technology provides a substantial clinical improvement. So the NTAP application is streamlined, and you only have to document that you meet the cost criteria. Then on the outpatient side, with transitional pass-through payment, you still have to meet the newness criteria, but that's a relatively easy thing to do. However, you do get the same benefit of not having to demonstrate substantial clinical improvement. You're already considered to have that by having breakthrough designation. And of course, you have to meet the cost criteria. So when you think about breakthrough, one of the things that you're getting is fewer hurdles and an easier route to qualifying for these very valuable new technology payments. Okay, next slide. Okay, so now we're going to take a deeper look first at NTAP. Okay, next slide. And we just went over this, but let's focus on cost. So in order to qualify for cost, the critical concept is that you have to show that payment is inadequate. And that's done on a per case basis when it comes time to granting the NTAP payment, and you also have to meet a cost threshold. So let me show you in more detail. Next slide. Okay, so this is how CMS determines whether the technology has met the cost criteria. This is in the graph, that's the distribution of all charges within a DRG. And the red line is CMS's cost threshold, and that's set at 3/4 of one standard deviation greater than the mean charge for all cases within the DRG. And what CMS wants a technology to demonstrate is that the average charge for the technology cases or new technology cases is in the right tail, so to the right of the threshold. And the way you do that, you actually have to go and look in the Medicare claims data. So there's a file called MedPAR that has all of the hospital claims under Medicare, and you have to isolate the population that's who are candidates for your technology. And you do this by identifying ICD-10 diagnosis codes, ICD-10 procedure codes, and come up with your subgroup. And then you look at the average charge for that subgroup. That's step one. Then you go on and you model actually what the cost would be with your technology. So the first step is you remove the charges from your subgroup analysis for technologies that you are replacing. You subtract those out, and then you go back and add in what you expect to be the charge, the hospital charge for your new technology. You add that back in, and then this modeled amount is compared against that red line threshold. And if you come to the right of that in the distribution, then you are likely to qualify for NTAP. And that's it. I mean, it does require the claims analysis, and it does require some research on other costs, but it's not a terribly difficult analysis to do. Okay, next slide. Now, when it comes time to actually understanding what the payment amount is, you have to understand the test is, well, first of all, it's granted on a case-by-case basis. So each claim that has an NTAP code is going to be evaluated to see if the hospital cost exceeds the MSDRG payment. So in my example below, let's say we have a new technology cost, and that's cost, not charge, a cost of $20,000 to the hospital, and the MSDRG payment is $25,000. So if the hospital cost for that case is 22, in that example, it won't qualify for an NTAP payment for that case because the cost does not exceed the payment. But in the second example, the cost in this case is $35,000, so it does exceed the payment and it would qualify for an NTAP payment. And so there's a deficit of $10,000. And so the payment is calculated on that difference. And if you look over on the right, the actual formula is 65% of the amount by which the cost exceeds the payment, or $6,500 in this case. That's capped at 65% of the total cost of the technology. So if it's a $20,000 technology, the maximum available NTAP payment would be $13,000. Even if the cost overage was $40,000 or $60,000, NTAP would only deliver 13. But that 13 is enough to modify hospital incentives and to ensure that they're going to give great consideration to using a new technology. Okay, next slide. NTAP expires after 2 to 3 years, and when it expires, then the payment is rebundled into the DRGs. And finally, when you apply for NTAP, you also have to apply separately for an ICD-10 PCS procedure code. It's not a difficult application, but you can apply twice a year, once in December, once in June. There's a public meeting, and then the codes, if approved, go into effect about 10 months later. So that's a second step. You apply for NTAP in October, and then typically you would apply for an ICD-10 code in December. Okay, next slide. Okay, so now let's look at transitional pass-through. Next slide. Okay, so let's just talk very briefly about newness. So you do have to qualify for this even if you're breakthrough. Newness means that you've received your FDA approval or clearance within the last 3 years, and also that you're not appropriately described by an existing device category that already has pass-through payment. If you qualify for those two things, then you're considered to be new. And then on the cost side, there are 3 cost tests that you have to qualify for. As we said earlier, you're exempt from substantial clinical improvement. Okay, next slide. Now, the cost tests look kind of complicated, but I'll just walk you through what those are. So I have an example at the top of APC 5114 for knee arthroscopy, and that has a payment of $59.81. And the first of the 3 tests is, oh, and my example is the hospital cost of the new technology is $3,000. So the first test is that the $3,000 has to be greater than 25% of the APC payment, which is $59.81. So as you can see, it meets that test. Now, there's a concept which is called device offset, and that is the portion of the APC payment that is already devoted to the device cost. So in our example, it's 36% of the $59.81, which is $21.84. So $21.84 is already included for device costs. And the second test is the $3,000 has to exceed 25% of the device offset, which is only $546. So our technology meets that test also. Then the third test is the cost of the technology minus the device offset, so that's $816, has to exceed 10% of the payment, or $598. And it exceeds that test as well. So in our example here, the $3,000 device would qualify for pass-through on the cost criteria. Okay, next slide. Now, we haven't talked about what the transitional pass-through payment is, and it's basically the cost or the hospital cost of the technology minus the device offset, or in this case, it would be an extra $816 for the hospital on the $3,000 new technology cost. And again, you know, that's a very nice benefit to the hospital. They normally wouldn't be getting that with other technologies that they're already using. So it's a very nice benefit, especially when you're first coming to market. Okay, then like NTAP, pass-through does expire after 2 to 3 years, and then the amounts are rebundled back into the APC payment, and would presumably making the payment go higher. Okay, next slide. And the last thing, unlike in NTAP, where you have to apply separately for a code, when you apply for pass-through, the code is part of the application. So if you're successful getting transitional pass-through, CMS will issue you a HCPCS code, a HCPCS level 2 code that's called a C code, and it'll take the format of C, then with 4 numbers after it. And the hospital would have to bill that C code in order to get the transitional pass-through payment. And so that's kind of a quick look there. So just a couple closing items. So first of all, as I said, this is not an automatic part of Breakthrough. You have to take your own initiative, establish contact with CMS, and make your own applications. And that's something that we do at MCRA all the time. We'd be happy to help. Second of all, this is not meant to be, these payment routes are not meant to be a reward or an entitlement for innovators. What they really are set up to be is stop loss payments to hospitals. That's why you have to qualify under the cost criteria to show that hospital payment otherwise would be inadequate. And therefore, one good way to have inadequate payment for the hospital is for you to be on the expensive side. So whether it's an expensive hospitalization for NTAP, or if it's an expensive device cost under transitional pass-through, that's one of the keys to qualify. So with that, let me turn it over to Tonya for a look at coverage.
Thank you, John and John, appreciate that. So we've talked about payment and coding in particular for new breakthrough devices. Let's turn our attention now to the real key fundamental component of reimbursement, and that is coverage. And that's essentially the means by which payers, both commercial and Medicare payers and Medicaid and other payers, look to determine if a technology is reasonable and necessary or medically necessary for a certain patient population and under specific conditions. Next slide. So there are two essentially main mechanisms by Medicare to provide coverage for technologies, services, devices, and procedures. One is the National Coverage Decision Mechanism, and that is through CMS. And so coverage is granted for procedures and technologies, again, that meet the reasonable and necessary criteria. This is not the norm of the way that technologies are covered, and is rather the exception, essentially, and used really for high-profile, high-impact, controversial technologies such as TAVR, the Edwards TAVR device, or LivaNova's VNS therapy. Oftentimes, the NCDs are met with a requirement to do a coverage with evidence development protocol, so that includes oftentimes a registry. And these decisions are binding on all Medicare contractors, or MACs, and typically take about 9 to 12 months to establish. The other way that Medicare covers technologies formally is through the local coverage decisions, or LCDs, again, through one of the 12 MACs across the country. And the Medicare contractors are those entities that manage and finance, if you will, the Medicare program across the country. So MACs establish local coverage decisions, again, based on technologies that are reasonable and necessary and meet that criteria. And oftentimes the MAC policies differ across regions. So one MAC may have a coverage policy that's positive for a technology, whereas another MAC across the country may have one that's negative. So there definitely there's a lot of inconsistencies that exist. And in the absence of any type of formal coverage policy, either through an NCD or an LCD, the technologies, procedures, and devices are actually reviewed on a case-by-case basis when the claim comes in to determine whether or not they are reasonable and necessary and covered. Next slide, John. So to really kind of resolve the issue of the timeframes that exist for NCDs and the inconsistencies that currently exist for LCDs, CMS recently published a proposed rule known as the Medicare Coverage of Innovative Technology Rule, and it's a proposed rule, otherwise known as the MCIT, and it was published in the latter part of August. And the proposal essentially seeks to fast-track coverage through the MCIT pathway for devices that have already secured FDA breakthrough status and that are already received market authorization through FDA. The rule also seeks to codify the definition of reasonable and necessary, and you heard me mention those two terms a few minutes ago, for Medicare coverage determinations, and then that way that they will consider one of the CMS coverage requirements to be met for an item or service if it is currently covered under commercial payer policies. The time frame by which they're proposing this rule is that they would provide immediate coverage for, again, devices that receive breakthrough status for a period of 4 years. So essentially the coverage would be established and in place for 4 years. And what happens when this coverage ends? The breakthrough device would be subject to one of the following: the NCD, a positive NCD national coverage decision. Again, that's binding on all the MACs. A non-coverage decision, so basically it's negative coverage, again, binding on all the MACs, or MAC discretion, so on a claim-by-claim adjudication. Next slide. So there are some key considerations for manufacturers, and first and foremost, again, because the MCIT is in a proposed state, there are several unanswered questions, especially in how this is going to be operationalized. The FDA marketing authorization, again, must be established, and breakthrough devices must be used for the FDA approved or cleared indication. So in other words, the MCIT will only apply for that device's cleared or approved indication. The program is voluntary. It's initiated when a manufacturer notifies CMS of its intention to utilize the MCIT pathway. So just because you have a technology that's breakthrough, and just because you might have NTAP or a transitional pass-through payment, you don't necessarily have to go through the MCIT pathway. So again, going from that coverage, coding, and payment, 3 interrelated concepts, very important to keep in mind. And I think the third piece that's really a primary consideration for manufacturers is, although CMS is not mandating that manufacturers who go through the MCIT process and have coverage for that 4-year period, they're not mandating that evidence be generated during that time. There's an inherent, I think, requirement that manufacturers do continue to generate evidence during that 4-year time frame, especially as if we think about what happens after that 4-year period ends. And also, especially if we think about what commercial payers will be looking at in terms of coverage policies. And I'll make that note in just a second. But again, because there are so many unanswered questions and I think opinions of how this should be rolled out and operationalized, CMS is seeking comments that are due next week, November 2nd. And so we encourage any stakeholder and industry to really read through the rule, the proposed rule, determine how it may impact them, and submit comments by that time. Next slide, please. So I mentioned a few minutes ago that a major consideration here is the evidence that the technology will need for coverage aside from Medicare. So let's think about the commercial payer criteria, and if your technology has a big commercial payer base, you definitely want to make sure that you meet the criteria that's generally in place for commercial payers to make positive decisions. And I would say first and foremost, really looking at how does the technology impact positively patient outcomes, or as opposed to the established alternatives or the standard of care. So it's really, really important to think about your end-to-end evidence generation strategy, as John Doucet mentioned earlier, from beginning to end, to support the coverage piece, again, the most foundational and an important piece of reimbursement. Next slide. So just to kind of go over some key takeaways from the presentation today, to reiterate some things, new technology payment under Medicare is not a reward for breakthrough devices or an entitlement for innovators. It is essentially a stop-loss payment mechanism for hospitals. Breakthrough devices must still qualify for payment, but have the benefit of being exempt from newness and/or substantial clinical improvement criteria for NTAP and transitional pass-through payment. And having higher costs compared to the rest of the cases within an MSDRG or the rest of the devices within an APC is key to meeting that cost criterion. And that's why we always say, think about this early on in your clinical evidence strategy and in the regulatory process. MCIT is again in a proposed state, and comments to CMS from interested stakeholders is imperative and certainly encouraged. And coverage through MCIT is temporary and will not guarantee coverage with commercial payers, with Medicaid agencies or other payers, nor will it guarantee continued coverage with CMS once that 4-year period is over. The next slide. So we put together some brief benefits and challenges from a reimbursement and regulatory standpoint. Obviously, for breakthrough devices, the benefits are the NTAP and the transitional pass-through payment, as well as the proposed MCIC coverage. I think some of the assumptions that we can, again, look at as challenges are we should not assume that a breakthrough status automatically equals coverage and payment. And as we've learned today, technologies must still meet specific criteria. And I'll hand it over to John Doucet to talk about the regulatory benefits and challenges.
Yeah, thanks, Tonya. So mentioned some of these before. Special interaction mechanisms created to interact with FDA. So to promote collaboration and speed and focus. The one thing I want to say, it give you a little peek behind the curtain at the FDA, that breakthrough label is so key. So when you think about it, just to give you some numbers, over the last 5 years, FDA has designated breakthrough for about 400 devices. Over that same period, there have been thousands of 510Ks that have been cleared. Let me tell you, when a breakthrough device 510K shows up on a doorstep, the very top leadership of the FDA knows it's shown up. And think about your own companies. If the CEO of the company knows about something and wants something to go fast, it happens. So, the same thing inside the FDA, you want that label. The challenge is the novelty. FDA, it's intrinsic to the place. It's a regulatory agency. It's built for stability. A mentor of mine at the FDA one time said to me that FDA is like an ocean liner going down the ocean. It's tough to make a sharp left or a sharp right. And at the same time, that's why the Breakthrough Program was created. These devices are too important, and we need to focus and need more speed than is typical for a regulatory agency. So let me go to the next slide. So we have some questions that we obtained beforehand or that just frequently are asked, and we're just going to go through these. The first one is, does the chosen approval route, 510K PMA, in combination with FDA Breakthrough Device Designation have implications on the request for NTAP or TPT, and what are the considerations for coverage? So John or Tonya?
Yeah, I guess I'll go. So I think one thing, there's a bit of an equalizer here on the technology add-on payment applications. So they're not specifically looking at, is it a 510K or is it a PMA? So if you have a 510K device, you have potentially the same shot at qualifying. You really have to look more at those cost tests. So in other words, I don't think that the chosen approval route necessarily makes that big of a difference.
Yeah, I think in terms of coverage, special consideration should be given to that piece. Again, I'll not get on my soapbox, but it is one of the most important pieces of the reimbursement concepts is, since the evidence requirement for a 510K are minimal, essentially, or nil, and there's minimal lack of data that would be required, you do need to pay attention to that for coverage from the third-party payers, again, post-approval.
Thanks. So the next question that typically comes up, does the FDA Breakthrough Device Designation influence the assignment of category A or B to IDE upcoming studies? So I'm going to do this briefly because I want to get to your questions from the audience. The short answer is no direct influence. It doesn't matter if you have a breakthrough designation. The categorization of A or B by FDA when they approve your IDE, it really has no influence of whether or not you're designated as a breakthrough device. So the last question, before getting to your questions from now, how can a device cleared under a 510K be considered breakthrough? It seems counterintuitive. So before answering, let's just take a step back and consider what devices are eligible for the 510K pathway. So to be eligible, device has to have the same intended use as a predicate, and any differences in technology cannot raise different questions of safety and effectiveness. So a breakthrough device might have a different indications for use statement when compared to a predicate, but it might have the same intended use as the predicate and therefore be eligible for the 510K. And a breakthrough device also might have different technology when compared to a predicate, but the differences might not raise different questions and thus be eligible for 510K. So the 510K pathway is built to be flexible, and it can handle certain kinds of breakthrough devices. Now, having said that, most of the devices granted the designation while I was at the FDA, they were heading towards de novo and PMA pathways for sure, but not all. So want to get to your questions, and before then, just want to say thank you to everyone for attending, and now would love to hear your questions.
Thanks so much, John, and John McDermott and Tonya as well. Excellent presentation. We actually have a huge number of questions through, which just shows the interest in this topic and a lot of the things that you presented. Just so everyone's aware, obviously the webinar is due to close in a few minutes' time, so it's we kind of overrun a little bit, and we will get to a number of these questions. Any questions that we don't get through, I will be providing all of the questions through to the MCRA team, and then they'll be able to follow up with you and answer your questions if we aren't able to get to it, because we have approaching 30 questions here, which is going to be impossible for us to reach in the time. Please, I'm obviously not an expert in the subject myself, so if any of these have been sort of covered in some detail somewhere else early on, then do let me know. But maybe just starting off with the first question that was asked by Elizabeth Monroe. So the question was, in your experience, does FDA typically meet the timeline targets for sprints for breakthrough devices? Pre-sub timeline targets aren't always adhered to, particularly during COVID-19.
Yeah, so I'm not sure how to address the COVID-19. I'm sure, as you know, the FDA is overwhelmed right now with EUAs and everything having to do with that, but they do their best to meet sprint timelines. Yes, they do meet sprint timelines if the sprint submission is aligned with the guidance document description of a sprint. So what I've seen some companies do, they get a breakthrough, they submit a sprint, but it's like 1,000 pages long. It has nothing to do, or it's not aligned with the definition of a sprint being one topic, one goal. So if you submit a huge bolus of information to the FDA, they probably are not going to be able to meet that very back and forth, 7 days, 14 days sprint timeline. However, if you do align with the guidance document information, they more often than not are going to meet that sprint timeline with you. That's the goal: expedite access to breakthrough devices, and the sprint mechanism is key.
Excellent. I think another question here from Angela Smalley. How will coverage be available for breakthrough digital therapeutics that don't have a CMS benefit category?
I'll take that one. Remote patient monitoring devices or digital devices are eligible for coverage under the MCIT if they do have breakthrough status. However, the benefit category for digital health devices is not clearly defined by Medicare. And, industry should be seeking clarification from CMS on a clearer definition for an RPM category, again, in their comments and in the context of the MCIT proposal. That's a great question.
Excellent. This one is from an anonymous attendee, and maybe hard to give full figures, but a rough estimate. If you could provide a rough estimate for the cost of taking a device through the breakthrough designation route, including, for example, the cost of engaging with an expert advisor like McDermott. If that's something you are able to answer.
John can take that one. John Doucet. Maybe we should take that one offline.
Yeah, okay, all right.
Cool.
That sounds good.
No problem.
Okay,
Whoever
yeah.
asked that question, it was an anonymous attendee, but yeah, please do send me a message and we can connect offline on that one.
Yeah, I think it's variable for sure. That would be my answer.
Case by case, that's right.
So we have a question here from Peter Ruff. So we have 3 clinical studies in Europe showing real life evidence, being able to triage patients at the beginning and removing 60% of patients from referral for further examination. Will such a test qualify as breakthrough device? Do we need an additional study in the US?
You don't need to do a study in the US. OUS data is perfectly acceptable to support a breakthrough device designation request.
Perfect.
You would, let me just say from a reimbursement standpoint, you would need US data for, again, commercial payer coverage and continued coverage with Medicare, as in addition to if there was a unique coding pathway that you were going down with CPT. I know we didn't talk a lot about that today, but you need a US patient population studied.
Excellent. And Cliff Amsel asked if you could comment on how things differ for DME equipment and codes.
So let me start with that one, and maybe Tonya can chime in. So the pathways that we talked about were only for inpatient hospital and outpatient or ASC. So if the DME can be used within those settings and billed under those payment systems, then there's no problem. But there is no existing NTAP or pass-through category for services that are billed under the Medicare DME benefit. That doesn't exist as of today.
I'll turn it to John Doucet and ask, what is the eligibility criteria for DME, and does that meet, can a DME have a breakthrough status?
What's a DME? What's that?
Durable medical equipment.
Yeah, I don't think there's any special category or criteria or for a durable medical equipment. They would need to meet the same criteria. It would be the same process as any other device. And you would submit a designation request and you'd get a response within 60 days. There's just no particular yes or no to that category of devices.
Yeah.
Okay, excellent. And a very recent question, can you provide any guidance on what qualifies as life-threatening conditions to qualify for BDD? So for example, would a device that prevents falls in the elderly qualify as a fall leading to, is a leading cause of death in the elderly?
Yeah, so the guidance document actually does a very nice job of defining what is meant by life-threatening. And as people, unless you interrupt the course of the disease or condition, that it's very likely that they're going to die. That's, very, very soon. So they're trending downhill. So someone who might experience a fall, that's probably not going to qualify as life-threatening. In the context of a breakthrough designation request, again, I would refer you to the guidance document for the specific definition and guidance about what's meant by that. But in a nutshell, a fall, probably not.
Okay. And Steve Davis has asked, how often are breakthrough devices rejected as a sort of rough percentage? And what would you say are the main reasons or why they're rejected usually?
Yep. So about 40% are rejected. So that's pretty good, 60% success rate. 40% are rejected. I would say about 30% of the rejections are due to indications for use statement. FDA and the sponsor never get on the same page with who the patient population is, which is amazing, but that happens. They never define a patient population with a life-threatening or irreversibly debilitating condition. And then the other probably 60 to 70% is the evidence accumulated thus far or presented, that be that literature, bench, animal, or maybe even some pilot clinical data to support reasonable expectation that you're going to be more effective than standard of care. It's just not there. In other words, it's not predictive, or the FDA doesn't buy that there's a reasonable expectation it's going to be more effective. So, 7 out of 10 due to the evidence, 3 out of 10 due to the IFU statement.
And Joanna Zylas has asked, if your new technology fits within a coding paradigm already established, does CMS confirm that equivalence with you?
I'll start with that one. It depends on the actual coding assignment we're talking about. CMS manages 2 different coding pathways, the ICD-10 procedure codes and HCPCS codes, whereas the AMA CPT, the American Medical Association CPT, manages CPT codes. So I think the answer is a little bit more involved, but it really depends on the coding pathway. And then the payment mechanisms differ. Again, as John McDermott mentioned, the physicians receive a certain payment and the hospital receives a specific payment separately. And depending on what care setting, inpatient or outpatient, that would differ. So I think the answer is a little bit more detailed. John, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I don't know that they would actually confirm a code for you. You can talk to them about the process for applying for a new code, but I don't believe they would consider themselves to be in the advice giving business. Now, that being said, you can submit applications or have discussions with them in advance of submitting those about what the process would be. But it's not the situation where you can call up and say, I have this code, will that code work? I don't think they would answer that question.
Yeah, and if you wanted to validate the CPT code, you'd need to go to the specialty society that would manage that code set and determine if you could use that coding construct for your technology.
Excellent. I think maybe have time for maybe doing a couple more questions, but they do keep rolling in. So we'll probably end up staying here till the end of the day US time if we continued. We'll make sure to keep all of these. As I said, we will be sending over the recording of the presentation. We'll be sending over the slide deck, and we'll also be sharing these questions with the team at MCRA, and I'm sure they'll be very happy to talk to you offline and answer some of these questions if we haven't got to them. So I'll pick a last couple before we close off the webinar today. One from Martina Petkoff. Is there a publicly available FDA database for devices that are part of the Breakthrough Device Program?
Yeah, I used to get that question I would say about 6 times a week. I mean, I know it makes, no, the answer is no. I think the way FDA thinks about it is, when a company, this is pre-market, they haven't submitted a marketing application, it's proprietary information. That's the way FDA views the breakthrough designation request and even the receipt of the breakthrough designation. Now, having said that, most companies do pretty quickly turn around and broadcast that they've received a designation as a breakthrough device, but there is no publicly available database.
Okay, perfect. And yeah, to pick one last question, but before we sign off here. So Jeff Withrow's asked, where no coding pathway exists for a new technology, can you still satisfy the cost criteria required for NTAP, or must you use an equivalent code?
Could you read that? I missed the first part of that. Could you repeat that, Josh? It was quite an elaborate question.
It was. So where no coding pathway exists for a new technology, can you still satisfy the cost criteria required for NTAP, or must you use an equivalent code?
Well, okay, so with NTAP, you're applying before your new technology is on the market. That's why you can accelerate payment by that 21 months. So you don't have to be on the market for your technology. And that's where that claims analysis comes in with the MedPAR file. So you have to do just the best you can. If you're treating an established condition, so maybe not some new disease, you can go and pull the diagnosis codes, for that disease. And then you try to model what those patients are currently getting with standard of care through procedure codes. And what you're basically doing is you're getting the subpopulation of people within each DRG who are going to be candidates for your technology. So they're already being treated with standard of care. So there should be coding to identify them. Then, as I mentioned, then you come up with estimates of the costs that of the technologies you're replacing, and you strip those out, and then you add yours in. So you don't have to have codes for your technology. As long as you can identify standard of care, then you can model what the projected cost with your technology could be.
Fantastic. Well, with that as a sentence, we're already well over. Yeah, a huge thank you to John, and Tonya for sharing their expertise and insights with you all. We'll follow up tomorrow with that link to the presentation and the slides, and also share these additional questions with you and the MCRA team, so that you can follow up and have some of these answered. Yeah, hopefully there are a number of you out there who are able to go through this program and work with MCRA to get your devices through the program. So a huge thank you to all of the speakers today and to MCRA for being a partner with us for this ongoing medical innovation series. If you have any further questions or anything else that I can help with or connect with MCRA, then please just send me an email to josh@lsxleaders.com, and I'll be sure to coordinate and help as well. So thank you very much, wherever you're joining us from, if it's the end of your day or just beginning, and hope to see you again on the next one soon. Thank you, John, and Tonya.
Thank you, Josh. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.